This is Duke University.
So our next speaker is Sohail Daulatzai. His biography is here. He's also he's of the University of California at Irvine. His signature text is Black Star Crescent Moon, the Muslim International and Black Freedom Beyond America.
Welcome, everybody. Peace and blessings. Assalamu alaikum. I want to thank Omid, Juliana. Is man in the house? Mark Anthony Neal? Not yet. All right. For inviting me here and having me be part of what I think will be a really engaging conversation or set of conversations around Malcolm. I was debating about what to talk about today in light of so much that's been happening. So the beginning of the talk will kind of be what's reflected in the abstract. Not that anybody actually read it, but if you did and were looking to hear something around that, the beginning of the talk will kind of cover some of that stuff. And then later on in the talk, hopefully I'll have some time to kind of like tie some things together, but get at some of the more contemporary issues that I think are pressing around questions of race and white supremacy that Malcolm was so deeply engaged in. So part of the way I want to begin is to talk about the kind of recurrent presence of Malcolm as this kind of haunting figure around the empire. In my book, Black Star Crescent Moon, I try to trace that through kind of post-World War II ascension of U.S. to global hegemony as a result of, in many ways, the Cold War. Obviously, World War II decimates Europe. And I look at, in many ways, the rise of the United States, and with that, Malcolm X as a figure that upsets the kind of Cold War liberal narrative. But not just the Cold War liberal narrative that's tied to the project of civil rights. I think hopefully for a lot of us in this room, we know that Malcolm X wasn't a civil rights figure, right? And to call Malcolm a civil rights figure is a gross exaggeration or reframing or revisionist, if you will, understanding of who Malcolm was. Malcolm was in many ways deeply antithetical to the civil rights project. And in my book, I talk about civil rights coinciding, paralleling, and even legitimizing Cold War liberal projects of America under the guise of anti-communism. So in short, as I talk about in the book, early civil rights struggles, and we're talking about early civil rights, we're talking about the kind of traditional orthodox civil rights movement, embraced the mantra of anti-communism. And in embracing the mantra of anti-communism, sanctioned and agreed with under the logic that, Negroes are Americans, and this is Penny von Eschen's work and a whole bunch of other scholars, Negroes are Americans, and so in many ways, America's enemies are our enemies, right? And in many ways, the civil rights logic sought to kind of, in many ways, give sanction to the Cold War interventions that were taking place in Africa and Asia. So as I argue in the book, the Cold War in many ways was a coded race war. Right? It was a coded race war against fully fledged decolonization. Now, Malcolm emerges at this moment as a deep critic of not just civil rights as a project, but of U.S. empire. I make the connection very briefly in the book of Malcolm to Aimé Césaire and Césaire's classic text, Discourse on Colonialism, where he highlights the contradictions taking place within Europe around World War II and Nazism. For those of you who are familiar with that book, if you're not, it's a real short book. It's a book that changed my life. But in the book, César talks about how for the French and the British, they look at Nazism as something evil when in fact they're Nazis too. That from the perspective of the third world, master race philosophy was endemic to Europe. And it didn't matter whether it was coming from the French, the British, or the Germans, right? So César points out this fundamental contradiction within the European project of modernity. Malcolm, as I argue in the book, similarly does that in the era of the Cold War. That for Malcolm, the Cold War was another project of empire building. But it was done at a time when Black liberation struggles were seeking to take place in the United States after World War II, when a vibrant Black left had kind of emerged, right? So Malcolm kind of points out that the Cold War liberalism, in many ways, the anti-communist foreign policy of the US and its domestic kind of iteration contained dissent, right? That is to say, here in the United States, to be labeled a red, right? To be called a communist was illegal. That was jail time. People lost jobs, people committed suicide for a whole host of reasons. So the Cold War hysteria had a severe chilling effect on the kinds of dissent that were taking place domestically in the United States. Of course, deeply impacting the kind of contours of what would be civil rights and other forms of political dissent. But obviously, globally, anti-communism kind of contained the kind of margins and undermined in many ways directly fully fledged third world decolonization. So Malcolm saw the kind of contradictions and the problems that this would arise. And what I ultimately end up doing in the book and framing Malcolm in this way is to ultimately make the connection between the logic of the Cold War liberalism, and war on terror liberalism. Right? In many ways, I want to talk about and close with a discussion of anti-communism and the new rubric of anti-terror as a new founding paradigm of a racial logic of anti-terrorism, right? And the kind of centrality that this paradigm has within the American imagination today and how it contains and controls kind of certain forms of dissent domestically and obviously globally. But I trace Malcolm's emergence during this moment of the Cold War and the civil rights and the kind of, if you will, ideological and rhetorical thorn that he was to the empire. I trace it then through the emergence of Black Power, and Hisham talked about kind of the influence of Malcolm on Black Power. And when you read the kind of early documents of the Panthers, they talk about how Malcolm in many ways is its ideological architect. He's the one who basically greases the wheels, if you will, for the emergence of Black Power. I also talk about then the influence, post-Black Power. And I should stop there. One of the things that I think it's, I talk about in my book, I have a kind of overarching frame that I seek to kind of position this in, is this notion of the Muslim international, right? I'm framing Malcolm through this idea of a Muslim international, which is this kind of non-national space of kind of anti-racism, anti-imperialism, that kind of is a space of overlapping diasporas, because I'm looking at the way in which Malcolm and kind of third world liberation struggles, particularly in what I call the Muslim third world, are connecting to each other. So how Black radicalism and the Muslim third world kind of come together. And in my chapter on the Panthers, I talk about their time in Algeria and the centrality of Algeria and Fanon, and even a film like The Battle of Algiers, not just simply on Black political organization in the early 70s, late 60s and early 70s, but also kind of cultural production. So I talk about the influence of Malcolm at this moment in the late 60s, early 70s, but I also then talk about him in terms of the emergence of hip hop culture. I have a chapter there where I talk about post-Black Power, when we look at the kind of war on crime or the war on drugs, whatever you want to call it, and the rise of the carceral state in America. I talk about the kind of twin pillars of American statecraft that emerged in the early 70s. For the first time within U.S., not the first time, but in a very powerful way that comes to the fore, the language of the Muslim terrorist starts to emerge within the early 70s within U.S. kind of policy circles, mainstream media, and whatnot, in terms of like a more concerted effort. Obviously, it has, it's sprinkled in other places. Remy Brulin has done some really incredible work on talking about this. But you see the emergence in the early 70s of the Muslim terrorist as this kind of threat to a U.S. kind of global order. But simultaneously, you see domestically the emergence of the Black criminal in the war on crime. So I talk about how these two figures continue in the post-civil rights era to haunt the kind of domestic and foreign policy ambitions of the United States. And I do that as a way of setting up my discussion around hip hop culture and the centrality of Malcolm at this particular moment as hip hop becomes the kind of voice, the scream against the kind of silence that was imposed by the Reagan-Bush-Clinton years, right? And not just Malcolm, but obviously, Zahir is going to talk about this as well, a figure like Farrakhan and the Nation of Islam, the Nation of Gods and Earths, and this kind of like ideologically hybrid kind of moment that hip hop culture sought to bring together. And Malcolm becomes obviously, a powerful figure here, culminating in Spike's film in 1992. So you see Malcolm continuing to be this kind of recurrent figure in the 80s and 90s. And I then move on to talk about how when we get to the 1990s, the Berlin Wall falls and we emerge into the post-Cold War moment. And I begin to talk about this post-Cold War moment and what is seen as the rise of the Green Menace, right? There's all this talk within policy circles about who and what is going to define U.S. national identity. And of course, it's the Muslims, right? Islam, Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations thesis kind of, stakes a claim and becomes in many ways the paradigm that's going to define the United States globally. So the Muslim, Islam, the rise of the Green Menace emerged in the early 90s. And as I argue in the book, in the way in which a figure like Muhammad Ali emerges, I argue that the co-optation of Ali as this figure in the 1990s, he's named Athlete of the Century by 2000, he lights the Olympic torch in Atlanta. Ali is this kind of figure who emerges, I argue, as a way to kind of undermine the kind of force that Malcolm and the critique that Malcolm had in 80s and 90s hip hop and black youth culture at the moment, right? So Malcolm is this kind of figure in the 1990s that still kind of course, is latent, and depending upon the circles you're in, I mean, is still very much a vibrant part of social movements taking place. And then, of course, in the post 9/11 moment, I mean, Malcolm emerges in so many ways, and I talk about how, particularly when Obama is elected. I mean, we can talk about the different iterations during King Bush the first's or the second's presidencies. But when Obama is finally elected, right? I talk about in the book the fears around Obama. I mean, Obama is seen and feared to be a closet Muslim, right? I talk about this Pew poll that 61% of Americans believe that Obama is or might be a Muslim. And this is 2010 after he's already been elected. And it's not 61% of the Tea Party or the Republican Party. This is 61% of all of you, right? Supposedly, who believe that Obama is or might be a Muslim. So this kind of haunting of blackness and Islam, I argued in the introduction to the book, was really a deeper seated anxiety over the legacy of Malcolm X, right? Because in many ways, Malcolm really challenged the kind of foundational logic, right? Of the empire and the persistent kind of need, the enduring need within the United States to kind of wed blackness to the American national project, right? Malcolm's project at a fundamental level was about imagining blackness and black people not as national minorities, but as part of a global majority, right? This is the clip that Omid plays. And we talk about and we see the way in which Malcolm's really seeing white supremacy as this global phenomenon, right? But instead, the U.S. always tries to domesticate blackness, right? To see it as American. It's a way of kind of redeeming the national past. When you can have a president like Obama, it kind of seems to be like a cleansing, a purging of the trauma of slavery and its legacies. And Malcolm is the kind of enduring reminder of the work that still needs to be done. So you see Malcolm coming back, and I open up the book by talking about Malcolm emerging at the inauguration of Obama the first time, right? I talk about how when Dianne Feinstein, in a very short 2 to 3 minute introduction to Obama, this is, of course, January 15, 2009, the first admittedly black president has been elected in the United States. And, it's a high point of political theater. It's on the Mall on Washington, same place as the I Have a Dream speech. It's on King's birthday. You have the first black president, right? And so there's a tremendous amount of political theater, pomp and circumstance, what have you. And Feinstein takes the podium at this moment to introduce Barack Obama. And she says in her opening remarks, those who doubt the supremacy of the ballot or the bullet can never diminish, right, the success of the nonviolent struggles for justice and equality that made this day possible, right? So here she is in many ways, of course, edifying a particularly early moment of Dr. King, not a later King, right? Because it's very convenient to do that at this moment, not the anti-imperialist King. But in doing that, by invoking the civil rights struggle and invoking nonviolence, of course, she's historicizing Obama's presidency. Like that civil rights is in many ways Obama's presidency in many ways the logical outcome of the civil rights project, right? The post-racial dream, right? But in doing that, she says those who doubt the supremacy of the ballot over the bullet, right? She's invoking arguably Malcolm's most iconic speech, a speech both times when you read it closely, both in Detroit and in Cleveland, where he explicitly states the futility of black electoral participation, right? And so it's really interesting for me to see the way in which Malcolm continues to emerge within kind of U.S. statecraft and how he continues to be this kind of enduring reminder of, one, the unfinished work around structural white supremacy and racial domination, but also the way in which the empire has been expanding itself, right? So I say all that to say, and I wanted to kind of go into some more detail and maybe a little bit more nuance than I'm offering at this point, but hopefully there are going to be provocations enough that we'll have a Q&A period. How much time do I have?
About 5 minutes.
About 5 minutes. So I want to close then maybe by talking about some of the implications of this, because I think when we think about a figure like Malcolm, we're talking about somebody who, as I argued before, saw white supremacy and race, even in his post-Hajj moment, as structuring not just black life, but the social world, right? Globally, right? White supremacy becomes this kind of persistent kind of structuring logic. And for me, it's important to understand this in the current moment, where the ruling paradigm of terror or anti-terrorism is structuring so much about U.S. statecraft, both domestically and globally. This is part of the kind of new work that I'm doing and some of the thinking that I'm undergoing. And so forgive me for the maybe crudeness of the discussion, but I think you'll feel me or feel at least where I'm coming from in some of the ideas that I'm trying to put out. What I'm seeking to suggest is to talk about terrorism, right? To talk about terror, right, is a racially coded language, is racially coded as a term. As I'm talking about, terror is another way in the 21st century of reinvigorating the idea of the savage, right? It's a way of excommunicating particular bodies and ideas from the political community of Europe and the United States, right? But you're the anti-human, right? The unhuman, right? This is kind of historic within liberalism to kind of project outside of the political community illegitimate bodies or illegitimate ideas. So the figure of the terrorist becomes that. So it's a very racially coded kind of logic. And so what I'm seeking to kind of think through is that, you know, in today's age, we have this kind of ruling paradigm of terror that in many ways is undermining social movements and struggles, undermining responses to U.S. empire, right? And at the same time, you know, what we're seeing is a very liberal kind of response to this idea. And this is something that I find really troubling. And I don't think I have too much time to go into it. Because you often hear the kind of knee-jerk response when a white person kills somebody or does something or does a mass shooting, they're terrorists too, right? This becomes the kind of liberal kind of response. Well, see, not just Muslims are terrorists, other people are terrorists too, right? And to me, that's a very kind of liberal move in the mode of kind of colorblindness, right? One, it does what Daulatzai says, is it creates an epistemological object. It names something called terrorism that the state now must crack down on, right? And as we know now, to be labeled a terrorist, that's illegal in a political category. Once you label someone a terrorist, then they have all manner and means of the state to be violently cracked down upon, sanctioned, droned, tortured, murdered, right? To be called a terrorist. And so to me, I'm really hesitant about normalizing the idea of terrorism. Now, I know some of you are thinking, what about ISIS, right? Or any other kind of activity. I'm not suggesting that we're not critical of particular actions of individuals, movements, etc. What I am saying is that when we mobilize the logic of terrorism and we normalize it as an idea, then we give the state sanction to crack down on it. It's something the state then has to police and control. For me, in my thinking right now, it's akin to, during the era of the war on crime, right, the notion of the criminal or illegal, right, the illegal immigrant, right? It's like when we use the word criminal today, right, it's a racially coded idea. When we use the word illegal to refer to an immigrant, it's a racially coded idea, right? When we use the word terrorist today, as I'm arguing, it's a racially coded idea, right? So in closing, what I'm trying to suggest is that when we use these terms, we have to understand the kind of racial impetus behind them. Malcolm would argue, for example, that when we use the word criminal to refer to as a term, as a category, obviously the common sense consensus is we're talking about blackness. It's kind of racially coded as black. Malcolm would argue that in doing this, we're hiding who the real criminals are, right? When Malcolm would say, as far as like the use of illegal to refer to immigrants, right, we're hiding what's really illegal, right? The occupation of the Americas, right? the kind of settler colonial project that has kind of been imparted here in this country, right? And he would also argue that when we use the word terrorism, we mask who the real terrorists are, right? So I think it's really important, and if we're going to think about ourselves in the spirit of Malcolm, to think about at more fundamental epistemological levels the kind of critique we have to bear, right? Because more importantly, I think, and I think we're in a room where we can ask this kind of question for those of us who do this kind of work, is what purpose, to what ends is, or who is our work serving, right? Whose interests and to what ends? Because I think this is something that when Malcolm, obviously gave his life for, he was assassinated for the ideas that he had and the critique he brought to bear, as was Dr. King. I think it's important for us to continue to ask these fundamental questions, because we have to ask ourselves who and what interests is our work serving. All right, I'll close on that. Thank you for your time.